Hi, this is Phil McCauley for Labour Business TV, and I'm very pleased today to welcome Michelle Meagher, Senior Policy Fellow at the University College London Centre for Law, Economics and Society. Now, Michelle isn't just a brilliant person, she's also written a brilliant book. Her book is Competition is Killing Us: How Big Business is Harming Our Society and Planet, and What to Do About It. Well, before we discuss that, Michelle, how are you? And then you can tell me what we can do about it.
I'm very well, thank you, Phil. Thanks so much for having me on here. Yes, what to do about it? And that's the kind of big question. And so I really, in my book, what I'm really trying to do is answer, I suppose, this question of why does corporate capitalism concentrate wealth and power into so few hands, but spread its harms so widely? And so, what to do about it? The first thing we need to do is really see and understand corporate power. And I'm a competition lawyer by my background. So I'm kind of was really steeped in a particular understanding of competition, efficiency. Why do we have a whole market system that's really built on mergers and acquisitions, on growing market share? And I started to understand that actually this idea of competition is really being used as a cover for the creation of corporate power. And we don't actually have competitive markets. In fact, increasingly, we have a lot of evidence that the markets are highly concentrated, but we don't really even need the economic studies to show that. We can kind of look around us and see big tech, big pharma, in agriculture, in banking, of course. These are all sectors that are absolutely critical to our economic well-being, and they are all highly concentrated. And that has various implications, which I go through in the book. And one of the key answers, what do we actually do, is to reform the way that we deal with mergers and acquisitions, the way that we investigate monopolies, and really at its very core to reclaim the language around corporate power. We more or less don't have this word monopoly in our kind of everyday lexicon anymore. We don't talk about power in that way. We talk about all of the harms. We talk about inequality. We talk about environmental collapse. We talk about corruption of markets and the rigged economy, and corruption in political influence. But we don't yet connect that to the other side of the coin, where we are actually allowing companies very freely to accumulate that power. So we're kind of expecting them to be good whilst allowing them to be incredibly powerful. And so the book really goes into challenging how we got to that point, and really problematizing this idea of competition. The free market competition, we know it's been debunked in much of modern economics now, that this idea that we leave the market to be free and by itself it will give us the best possible world that we can have. We know that that's not true. What we haven't got yet is the step where we understand, okay, what has been missing from our analysis and how can we move forward.
Deeply fascinating. Now, you're ruffling a few feathers around the world with your book, reaching to parts that other economists and lawyers cannot reach. And this is a very powerful theory, and one in which I completely agree with you. Now, let's talk about reality. I mean, corporate power is very substantial. If you look at the United States, all politics is pretty much bought and paid for, whichever way you look at it, with lobby firms, interest groups, power elites, control of the message, the Marshall McLuhan ethos from the 60s of the medium being the message. That's now completely controlled by only 4 or 5 large-scale global Leviathan companies. Where can we even begin to rid ourselves of the encumbrances of change? I mean, how do you go about changing when there's, in the UK alone, over 2 billion a year spent on lobbying?
Well, it's a really important question. I mean, I think for years we've been focusing on campaign finance reform. So we think, the problem is that business is spending too much money influencing political campaigns, but actually business has been on the other side, particularly in the US, really bedding down its human rights to spend, to influence policy. We've got the influential decisions from the Supreme Court effectively creating a legal person, so in the corporation, that they have the same human rights to kind of democratic participation. So it's really that I would say has been a bit of a red herring. We've kind of gone in the wrong direction there.
Yes.
I would say that it's very reassuring that where these issues, I suppose, where the core is the most rotten, the issues of the kind of rising power of tech in particular, it's really in the US that there's starting to see a kind of, we're starting to see a very vibrant movement really to counter that. And I think that's incredibly helpful for anybody else around the world who wants to start to take on some of these predominantly US headquartered companies, that we have even the US Congress is investigating them. We have the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice suing to break up Facebook and Google. So if even they are starting to see that this could be a problem, then what the rest of us have known for a long time becomes a little bit more politically possible, I suppose, to really take on that power. But again, I think we have to come back to how do we stop companies from even getting to that position in the first place? I think it was something like, between them, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple have acquired something like 400 companies in the last 10 years. Some of almost, very few of those mergers actually needed any approval, because our thresholds for seeking approval are so low. They're usually based on your sales. Many of these companies that Facebook, so when Facebook is acquiring WhatsApp, or when they're acquiring Instagram, their worldwide turnover may be very low. But actually, what we should be looking at is how much is Facebook paying for this company? They're paying 18 billion or whatever it is for WhatsApp, for a company that had only a few employees. That should have been the trigger of understanding that there was a huge amount of value that Facebook saw in Instagram and WhatsApp. They understood that those companies were absolutely critical to their future monopoly. These were the only companies that could really challenge them, and we approved their acquisitions. They were approved by the US and in Europe as well. So I think we really need to understand, how do we even let companies get to the point where they can buy out Congress, or they can buy out governments around the world? Because ultimately now some of these companies are bigger than, have higher market capitalization than the GDPs of the countries that they're negotiating with.
Interesting. So does this mean, therefore, we're going to have to give regulators and government, for that matter, some actual teeth and some actual tech and some actual investment? I mean, it seems to me that HMRC can't even collect tax from these companies because they're so adept at manipulating the system in a way which is advantageous to them. And who can blame them if the law allows it in vaguest possible terms? How on earth is government going to compete with big tech? Or are we going to be able to see the development of good tech that is going to try and level the field? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it has to start from, I suppose, democratic principles. So we have to start to understand that we are in a position where there is such an imbalance of power between the state and the private sector, particular parts of the private sector, by the way. There are huge, vast swathes of business that are equally being harmed by these particular companies. So I wouldn't say that this isn't just an issue of the private versus the public. Actually, much of the private sector is kind of first point of being harmed by many of these companies, and even people who want to become entrepreneurs not able to start up. You're talking about good tech. Who's going to invest in them? Who would really invest in, if I came up to you and I said, I've got a great idea for a version, it's just like Facebook, but it's kind of going to protect your privacy, and it's going to be better, but it's also going to have its own way of making money. You would say, well, Facebook is going to eat you alive. They're going
Yes,
to...
but let me just pick you up on that point, because it just seems to me that there is a role for the state, though, in tech. I mean, for example, you've given a great example, and I was at a Nesta meeting a couple of years ago, and I was talking about the idea that you could have an advertising-free version of social media. We have state television in many democratic countries. We have public broadcasting in the United States, the BBC in the UK. Why shouldn't we have a BBC version of Facebook, so people aren't being pushed into opinions, but instead are free to use the communications techniques which are available? Is there a role for the state to counteract the overarching force of the private sector?
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think that I would sign up to that version of Facebook if you want to start it. I mean, I think that we can understand, anti-monopoly or challenging corporate power in different ways. So, one, the state has a role in regulating corporate power.
Mhm.
We've kind of discussed that. Two, the state has a role in providing public alternatives so that one of the problems with a monopoly is you have nowhere else to go. The users of Facebook really don't have that many alternatives. Well,
Mhm.
some of the alternatives are already owned by Facebook, and some
Mhm.
of the other alternatives are actually not really alternatives. It's kind of a very, very similar ecosystem. So the state has a role, and this isn't just in tech. This could be we already have that role in pharmaceuticals. We already have that role in many other ways, in many other sectors. But that is another role that the state has. But then we have some other roles as well. We have, or other kind of ways of pushing for an anti-monopoly agenda, or different forces, I suppose, that can challenge corporate power. So other roles include collective action on behalf of either civil society, labor, or business. So we have one of the problems is that small businesses not able to compete with big businesses, or not able to even bargain with big businesses that may be their counterparties. Either
Mhm.
they rely on them for inputs, or they rely on them for distribution.
Mhm.
So we have rules that effectively stop businesses from cooperating. So you would be a cartel if you got together and decided to collectively bargain with Amazon, or with Facebook for advertising, or whatever. So we need to think about how competition rules are actually preventing cooperation that would enable the challenging of corporate power, whether it be buyer power, or monopoly power, or whatever. So we can see this as really rethinking how the economy is organized. Who are the different players? Currently, we really only have the kind of dominant player. We don't have this role of the state in anything other than some certain sectors. We don't have powerful regulators maintaining that level playing field. And we also don't have this countervailing force of business, civil society, employees, etc., able to actually bargain with these powerful entities.
That's very interesting. Where does freedom of speech come into this? I ask you this in particular because, of course, the recent events with Donald Trump and others being thrown off Twitter and other public platforms arbitrarily, presumably in the interests of those platforms looking at a new regime coming in and looking at the avoidance of future regulations. The only assumption I can make for the reasons why they did that, not having done it for 4 years. Is it time for technology, and especially the big tech giants, to be regulated as publishers, so they're responsible for their content? And is this one area, perhaps, of regulation which could make a difference to who controls the message?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's remarkable that the tech companies have probably been kind of laughing behind the scenes that actually it's taken so long for us to really understand that they are publishers. This is all kind of legacy legislation that really set the boundaries for this, and it did not at all envisage the kind of tech platforms that we have now. And so absolutely, they should be responsible. I'm not sure if it should be exactly the same model that we've had in the past. I think that a lot of careful thought needs to go into how that's actually operating, so as not to allow for state censorship and so on. So there are clearly democratic issues at play. But I think that with Twitter and so on, shutting down these accounts, they're trying to show that they are responsible, but ultimately it shouldn't really be up to them. It's not
Mhm.
really their role to be deciding what is or is not kind of good for democracy. If we get to a point where they are the only ones who decide, then, as you suggest, they will do probably whatever it is most conducive for their business plan. So in this case, not being shut down is probably high on the agenda. So let's do things that mean that we're not going to be shut down. Okay, well, we'll silence particular voices, but we'll allow others to run rampant because nobody's really paying attention to them, and it's earning us lots of money.
Yes, of course, the eternal dilemma of short-term shareholder pleasing and all of that. But let me turn to this question. I mean, what about young people growing up in this environment now? You have young children yourself. You're thinking about their future. What kind of a world do you want them to grow up in? Because as far as I can tell, to some extent, we left capitalism behind after Thatcher sold everything, and we ended up in this corporatist structural society now, which has gone global, has gone offshore global, both financially, for tax, for control, outside of regulatory control. There's even technology now going into space and onto satellites. It's extraplanetary. That's going to be another problem for you lawyers to work out. What kind of society, can your children expect to grow up into in 15 and 20 years' time? What do you want for them?
Well, I would say that I don't think we have left capitalism behind. I think that actually what we have is the fullest manifestation of capitalism, that we have true unencumbered capitalism, where it is truly the case that the interests of capital reign supreme over everything else. And I completely agree with the trends that you've described, the corporatization, shareholder value. But to me, shareholder value is not actually the promotion of the interests of shareholders as a class. It is the promotion of the interests of a particular group of capital. And that again is, this the influence that capital has over the entire shaping of the world. So for the future that I want for my children, I think that it's a world in which they are actually able to participate. So freely able to participate. So I'm thinking about kind of a democratic economy. So we think of democracy purely in the political terms, but we need a democratic economy in which everybody can actually engage, start a business if they want to, pursue a good idea, provide for their own family, have decent work that is actually has some dignity and value attached to it. We should be valuing all different types of work that are currently completely ignored and underpaid and unpaid within society, but also not be seen as, every person is not a kind of factor of input. Right now, what we have is in this kind of obsession with, or I should say, the influence that capital has. We can see it in, for example, this constant drive for productivity. Really, we're talking about their capital productivity, and we kind of assume that labor will have to sort itself out. So if we need fewer workers, that's great. We get innovation, we grow the size of the pie. We're not redistributing it, but we're also not thinking about, people want to work, people want to have fulfilling lives where they are contributing to society. And currently we have vast swathes of people unemployed, underemployed, on part-time contracts and so on, living precariously, only further deepened by the crisis of the pandemic. And so I would like for us to live in the kind of economy where when the whole economy shuts down, it's not kind of, okay, that's it, everybody go fend for yourselves. We are absolutely in this all together. And I think that my goal really in challenging corporate power is so that when we we have the resources really to be providing for everyone. We are this extremely wealthy, well-resourced country, and we shouldn't be scrambling around down the back of the sofa to try and find enough resources to take care of everybody. And I would argue that a lot of those resources are being kind of sucked up through the corporate system, and that corporate power has a lot to answer for that.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the pandemic has taught us one thing, which is that even right-wing parties like the Conservative Party are capable of creating a pseudo basic minimum income, because we've seen that with furlough and various other techniques that have been somewhat misapplied, and certainly not to the whole of the population. But when you think about the future, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, as it seems to be inevitable that we're going to be facing a lot of unencumbered corporate growth and more consolidation, more power taking, more purchase control of government in the way we're seeing. Isn't it the case that the capitalist free market zeitgeist ought to really recognize that by having people having enough money to spend in their lives, in their economy, is in fact in their self-interest? Surely a new form of sort of futuristic social justice and socialism with a small s is required to ensure a free market. You can't have a free market if you don't have people with enough to spend in a free market. So where does minimum basic income come into this, and how might that be shaped in the future, especially in the digital economy that we have now?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you take this is a little bit of a kind of legal geek point, but the
Like though.
good. The principle of shareholder value and shareholder primacy was established in US law through this particular case. Dodge versus Ford. So this was the Ford Motor Company. One of its major shareholders were the Dodge brothers, and the Dodge brothers objected to Henry Ford's plan to increase the salaries of his workers. He actually wanted to pay them a dividend. where he was going to kind of announce this, I think it was $10 million or something. And as soon as he announced it, there was an enormous queue of workers queuing up outside his factory door, trying to get a job at his factory. And he wanted to reduce the price of his cars and share the wealth more broadly. He understood that if you were going to sell, hundreds and thousands of cars, then people need to be able to afford to buy them. And that's both your workers, but also, your kind of consuming public. He didn't win in his case. The Dodge brothers won, establishing the idea that as shareholders, they deserved, the maximum possible return. So he shouldn't be frittering away his resources on increasing salaries and so on. And there's a whole other separate discussion you could have about the fact that they were actually his major competitors. So they clearly had not just a kind of shareholder interest, but also a competitor interest as well. So absolutely, I think that we need to be thinking about, how do we make sure that people can participate in the economy? Minimum basic income is one. And also, I would argue that this principle of competition, that we can get the best out of people and out of businesses if they compete, really only works if people have their basic needs met. Actually, if they don't, then what you're really pushing people into is increasing levels of marginal desperation, where we have the kind of marginal extraction of our natural resources. We have people working, in really pretty horrendous conditions, and nobody can say that this is the kind of most generous version of capitalism. And so I absolutely agree on that.
So what does this mean for new formats of business? We've seen the growth in trend towards social enterprise, towards collectives, towards cooperative structures. Do we need to use government to incentivize the creation and the mass adoption of pro-good organizations, ones which are designed specifically by their owners and collaborators and participants to further the general purposes of the society? And I'm particularly thinking here about the aging population. I mean, by the time our kids, are our parents' age, there's going to be 10.5 to 11 billion people on the planet, and we're nearly 8 billion right now. There aren't any resources available for that number of people right now. We know that right now. So how are we going to take a more collective and collaborative approach to society? And what can regulation do to shape that market development?
I mean, the first thing to say is that law and regulation entirely create the market. So the market looks exactly like the law and regulation that we have want to look like. So I think law has an enormous role to play in changing those incentives. I just want to draw a slight distinction between businesses for good and collectives and so on. I entirely support collectivization and alternative business models that spread ownership more democratically. I think that is a fundamental part of this more democratic vision that I've described. It is not necessarily the case that all of those businesses would pursue wider social issues, but equally the other way around. I think there's been a lot of focus on businesses, corporate responsibility, businesses doing good, but without the kind of democratic ownership. Where is the accountability? Because you effectively have a situation where very large businesses are saying, we will go out and solve the world's problems, without really accounting for the fact that they may have been instrumental in creating the world's problems in the first place. So I think that there's kind of a little bit of terminology we have to get around there, some concepts to clarify. But the law can play an enormous role both in actually giving legal status to different types of organizations so that they get all of the benefits, limited liability and tax benefits and so on that a corporate structure gets. We can reduce the incentives for corporate mergers. So currently, as I touched on briefly, collectives of businesses can fall under problems because they can be seen as cartels. But if they were to merge and form into one corporate entity, that's totally fine. And very few mergers are blocked. So we have this kind of perverse incentive which really favors bigness, monopolies, and so on, and really disfavors collective action amongst individual economic businesses. This isn't, by the way, just cooperatives in the sense that we understand them, like buying cooperatives and so on. This could be cooperatives of gig economy workers. They're not treated as employees, they are treated as independent, autonomous businesses. And therefore, for them to collectively get together, there are barriers in the law to that. So I think that there are all sorts of ways that the state can exercise its market shaping and market creating power to create the economy that we want, and that would actually serve us.
Very interesting. Now, presently, of course, the government has taken special powers because of COVID, and they're completely ignoring any kind of need to tender or, for that matter, have any kind of due diligence on any of their supply chain. And there's a lot of investigations going into that behavior now by the Good Law Project, wondering how it is that people who have no interest in a business and can suddenly have hundreds of millions given to them by their chums in the government. How are we going to avoid this, what looks as though, what allegedly may be corruption going on in the state? And how can we ensure that those powers are not made permanent by a government which has such a substantial majority?
I mean, that is a question that's probably slightly outside of my expertise, but I have my personal opinions on it, which are really, I mean, I suppose it is connected in the sense that the vision of the economy that I think we're both kind of describing here is one in which I am not just a passive participant. I do not just receive whatever the state gives me.
Right.
The state is not just left to go out and provision itself however it sees fit. We are empowered, and currently we are really told, if you don't like something, vote with your wallet. You have power as a consumer. You have limited power as a citizen, and those powers are kind of very tightly circumscribed. But if I also have power and voice as a worker, as a member of civil society, if I also have voice through my business, if I also have voice through my community, we're talking about creating these other centers of power within our entire society, so that we are not left kind of asking these questions, having to have them litigated in the front pages. We are actually able to gain access to the information as you gain access to the process as it's happening. There are only certain people that were actually involved in that kind of very corrupt tendering process. I believe that there could be a lot more kind of oversight if we have these other structures within the society.
So accountability and visibility. And finally, when we start to think about, and in our particular interest at Labour Business, the Labour Party, Keir Starmer is now, of course, the leader of the Labour Party. What would be your key sort of urgent messages for him and his team to be thinking about in terms of the fact that competition is killing us? What does he need to think about? How might that evolve over the next couple of years towards a manifesto commitment to see the kind of change that you're advocating in your book?
Well, I think the first thing to think about, if we're trying to re-envisage the role of competition policy, is that competition policy now serves as our default industrial policy. We don't have a larger kind of clear vision for industrial policy within the UK. We're kind of very slowly starting to cobble one together, post-Brexit. But if we understand that in the meantime, all the while, we have been approving mergers, we've been changing the way that businesses cooperate, we've been essentially allowing monopolies to run free, then we have to retake control over that entire process. There should be different people involved in the decision-making process. Currently, it's an extremely technocratic field driven by a really inside community of competition experts. Where are the voices of those that are actually influenced by all of this, about the communities that may be harmed by the regional distribution of power and of monopoly profits and so on? So we need to be thinking about who gets to make decisions over what our economy looks like. We need to be really seeing and understanding power, not just power over consumers to increase prices. Actually, there are many ways that business exert power, and they indeed do currently rip off consumers. So that is certainly something that we're not kind of achieving well. But overall, I would say we need to take on power, understand it, harness it, and think about how it can be serving the public good.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you very much for your contribution today. We'll certainly be coming back to you as this whole story unfolds. Best of luck with the continuing success of your book, and thank you very much for your input. Good to
Thanks
see
so
you.
much,
Bye
Paul.
for now.